Speaker, side opposition has come to us today with an inapt understanding of what immigrants do in the country where they're from, what they do in the country where they go to, and what the entire purpose of an immigration system does. And in opposition to all three of these things, side proposition still proudly proposes before the House today. I'm going to do a couple things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to talk about what we just heard from side opposition and why it is that their proposed solution to a problem isn't actually able to fix much of anything, and also has not been adequately able to deal with the case that side proposition has brought forward to deal with the immigration problems in our world today. And then I'm going to move in to the final contention of side proposition, which is the idea of global political development and its very specific geopolitical benefits that can come from it. With that in mind, let's look at what we just heard from side opposition. The first thing they tried to do is they tried to look at what they just heard from us. And they looked first at our developed nations point. And they talked to you about unemployment, and they talked to you about big populations. And first of all, we would see that they weren't actually able to deal with the evidence we brought forward, but even with that in mind, let's look at what they talked about. We on side proposition already showed you that by increasing our population, we have to supply more things for them. When we have a larger population, we need more services, we need more managers, and we need a bigger job market. So what we've seen on side proposition is that our labor market is like an elastic. It expands when you put more things into it, and it is always able to accommodate those large groups of people. And so when they talk to you about this large unemployment, A, we haven't seen that it's been happening, and we don't expect it to in the future. But furthermore, let's also talk about the allocation of jobs. Because what we've seen already on side proposition is that by allowing more workers to come into this country, it allows us to try to reallocate labor where they're most needed, rather than simply where the spots are filled. And I'll give you an example. Let's first of all look at Alabama, which is down in the United States, of course, and is one of the big agriculture producers for the United States. In last year's growing season, they had to leave 2/3 of their lettuce product in the ground because they didn't have enough laborers to actually be able to process those kind of crops. So what we've seen already is that we've had serious issues with being able to supply labor and be able to supply it in the places where it's needed the most. We continue on by looking at the way that labor is allocated in the third world and in other countries that people are sending immigrants into. And what we found on side proposition once again is that there is serious issues with labor allocation in developing nations. We heard this even from Bill Gates, who said that he wouldn't outsource jobs, as many as he has, if there were more skilled laborers in the country that they run their business in. So what we've seen from a lot of different avenues is that we do need more labor, and even if we do have unemployment problems, it's not being caused by immigration, and there are serious issues with that assumption.
Sir.
Yes?
Then why has the United States not acted and allowed free immigration to help with this issue? There must be a reason why free immigration wasn't working. The Americans haven't employed it to get this lettuce out of the ground.
Well, yes, we would agree they should do something, and the fact that they haven't is quite appalling. But what we've already shown you is that there's a lot of issues, and they haven't done anything to fix it, and free immigration is the answer, and that's what we're trying to tell you today, not dealing with problems of things that they haven't dealt with yet. But furthermore, let's continue to look at what they talked about. Then they tried to look at this idea that our developing nations was a bad point. They tried to talk about this in the form of aid. And we really can only conflict this with one major statistic, which is that when we look at the World Bank, as we've already shown you, our foreign aid system isn't working. We supply, on average, about $40 billion a year to the entire third world. That's in comparison to the $403 billion that remittances send into the third world. That's 10 times what they're sending. So what we've already seen on side proposition is that these remittances are actually an even better form of cash flow into the third world to help real people and to be a form of foreign aid that actually works. Now finally, I'd like to talk about the counter model that you just heard from side opposition, because it really comes to show the problem of the point system, and we would have serious issue with it. The first major issue has to come from the fact that when we look at the point system, it has serious imbalances towards skilled and incredibly skilled labor. And while, of course, we agree all countries should want to have as much skilled labor as possible, they're unable to accept the fact that unskilled does not mean unneeded. And I've already talked to you about this through a lot of my class by saying that we do need people who aren't necessarily as skilled as we've been bringing people in. We need people to do jobs that we currently don't have the positions being filled. And that by opening up our labor market, we are actually helping Western society as well as the international spectrum. And finally, let's talk about the organization point, because this is also really important. They talked to you about the transition, and by saying that there are serious issues that are occurring. And we would have a lot of responses to this. The first simply being that immigrants don't take this choice lightly. It's not something that they haven't considered, and it's not something that systems aren't able to deal with. And also, what we've also seen from our model today is we're not just saying open borders, let's get rid of all boundaries and allow anyone to come in. That isn't what we're trying to propose. We're trying to propose an orderly system that we remove restrictions from, to allow more labor to come into the places where it's most needed. With all of that in mind, let's look at the final contention of side proposition, which is something we really want to hit home today, which has to do with the global political ramifications of this resolution. So let's talk about this. We would see that there are two major things that are going to happen. The first is major political development within the country, and the second big issue is the political relations and what develops as a result. So let's talk first about political development. We would see, to follow this logic strain on-side proposition, that if you allow anybody to be able to, as we say, vote with your feet, we're allowing governments suddenly to be under what we would see as a soft threat. The fact that they need to provide the most for their people in order to do one or both of two things. First, they need to try to ensure that they're bringing in more immigrants because they want a larger labor market. And second of all, we want to see that they're going to be making it so that their own people aren't going to want to leave. And so what we've seen is that that is going to encourage political development. It's going to encourage governments to try to bring in more services and be a better government for its people. And that affects on a local and an international scale. So let's first look at the European Union, which is of course our favorite example in today's debate. And when we look at the EU, let's look at the biggest populations. We would see that the two biggest economies in the EU are usually situated in France and Germany. When we look at that, there's also a very specific relationship between the number of immigrants that come into the country, which is of course the highest, and also the fewest number of immigrants that are leaving those two countries. So what we've seen on-side proposition is that there is a very direct relationship between having the biggest economy and bringing the most people in and ensuring that the least amount of people leave. So this, of course, creates political development. It makes governments want to be better. And we see examples of this, like when we look at Scandinavia, where they seem to be having a competition to see who can be creating the most utopian society by giving their citizens more and more things and giving them more and more services. So what we've continually seen on-side proposition is that this helps. And finally, let's look at political relations. Because when we have a string of open immigration between countries, we're going to see better political development. And our biggest case for this is when we think about the fact that we haven't seen a lot of major wars occurring in between countries that engage in massive amounts of immigration with each other. By spreading people, we're spreading culture, we're spreading ideals, and we're making the world an actual global state. With all of this in mind, I would like to close with a report that came out of the Center for Global Development, which said that by opening up immigration, we could do as much as doubling the world's GDP by allocating the right labor into the right resources and ensuring that the most amount of people go into the right amount of places. So for all of these reasons, what we've talked to you about today, because it's better for developed nations, because we're aiding developing nations, and because the global political scale is going to be constantly getting better as a result, we on-side proposition feel that we should be sending the best people to where the best jobs are and trying to help the world on a global scale. And this is why we propose a global solution for global issues. Thank you.